talking about DNS and specifically the best way to manage DNS and all the different benefits and how to properly manage DNS with Kerio Connect. So for the agenda, we'll start off with just a general introduction to DNS for those of you that may be somewhat new to DNS. Probably many of you that administer Kerio Connect are probably quite familiar, but for those that are new, we'll go into a little bit of introduction about the domain name system. And then we'll talk about how it relates to Kerio Connect for email delivery, identity management, and automatic discovery services. We'll also cover some of the tools that you can use to help configure and validate your DNS configuration. And as always, we'll open it up for questions and answers. And as you see, the pod there on the right, the Q&A pod, you can ask questions throughout the presentation, and I'll try to get to those when I can. So starting with just a very brief introduction of Kerio Connect, standard overview for those that are unfamiliar with Kerio Connect. So cross-platform support is one of the big focal points of the product, the fact that you can use a web interface, you can use Outlook, mobile devices, and then also deploying the product on a variety of different operating systems. So that's a significant benefit of the product. Big differentiator as well. Secure and protected email, so being able to encrypt messages using Secure MIME and making sure that everything is available over a secure encrypted connection is a big component of Kerio Connect. The BYOD, so being able to use any mobile device you want, whether it's primarily Android or iOS. We have support for ActiveSync or native protocols for that. Simplicity of administration, which is something I want to talk about today, and how easy it is to manage DNS particularly, but all other configuration aspects of Kerio Connect is something that is a differentiator as well. The variety of deployment options, so whether it's in the cloud, whether it's virtualized, Windows, Mac, Linux, so you can install the product in a variety of different ways. And then, of course, our recent introduction of Kerio Cloud, you can deploy it that way, or you can have it hosted through any one of our hosting partners. So we'll start off with just a general introduction of the domain name system, and starting with the background and motivation of why we even need DNS in the first place. Obviously, the main reason or motivation is that it's easier for us as humans to remember names. Well, computers, on the other hand, need to use numbers. So we need some type of a system that basically translates names into numbers, and just similar to a phone book. And so that's the main purpose of the domain name system, is to manage that conversion of human readable names into numbers, and that's the basics for the domain name system. So just as a very basic example here, relating to something that you're all familiar with, looking up somebody in a phone book or dialing a person, you want to contact a person by their name. The phone book tells you the telephone number that's associated with that person so that you can then go ahead and initiate the call. So the same is true for computers. If you're trying to go to a website, for example, bindbrewing.com, your computer does a lookup against the DNS system. It returns the IP address for the name that you want to connect to, and then you can access that location. The example here obviously being a website, but the purpose of this presentation here today is talking about email and how DNS relates specifically to email. So the way that that your domain gets registered, just to kind of go into the beginning of things, when you go through a registrar to actually purchase and become the owner of a domain, the registrar will then add you to an official domain registry that says that you are the actual owner of that domain name. But one of the components of that, as part of that registration process, the registrar defines you as the authoritative owner, or rather in charge of the management of DNS for your domain. So there are a set of root servers that dictate who are the authoritative name servers for each owner of each domain. So when you purchase a domain name, you become the owner of the DNS for your domain, and you manage the authoritative DNS servers. And so that's kind of the point here of this presentation, is to help you to best manage DNS, as if you are the one purchasing the domain name, how you can go about updating and managing your DNS records to get the best value out of Kerio Connect. So just talking about DNS servers, which is obviously a component of DNS, it provides the name to number mapping. So just previous to the Tommy and Jenny example of the phone book, they're providing that functionality. So the authoritative servers is really the definitive source. If we didn't have authoritative name servers, then anyone could be spoofing or providing whatever IP address they want for any domain name. So it's very important to make sure that there is some system in place, an official registry that defines who is the actual authoritative answer for a given domain name. And so as an example, at Kerio, we actually manage our own DNS. So our name servers, our authoritative name servers are ns1.kerio.com and ns2.kerio.com. And so we entirely manage those. So just to quickly address some of the types of records that you would be managing. And most of these, in fact, almost all of them we'll be talking about here in the presentation, but just to sort of introduce them beforehand as the kind of common types of records that you would be managing. Of course, the A record is the most basic and simple, converting a host name to an IP address. Then you have a PTR record, which is the inverse scenario, where you're actually mapping an IP address to a host name. A CNAME is something in between, where it's mapping an actual host name to another host name. Then you have an NS record, which is defining your authoritative name servers. So that's defining, where, if I'm doing a lookup, where do I actually look to resolve to get the definitive or authoritative answer for a given domain name. And then MX records, which probably many of you are already familiar with, and that's the standard type of DNS, or rather email configuration, is mapping a domain name to the authoritative or the responsible MTA or mail server for a given domain name. Then you have the service locator or SRV record, which is somewhat advanced and is becoming a lot more common. And as you'll see later on in the presentation, it's something that we will configure with certain types of services with Kerio Connect. But it's more protocol specific, and it's allowing lookups to provide more information, usually protocol specific information. So it's not just a simple host to IP, it's actually providing a bit more information about certain types of protocols. And a TXT record is kind of similar in that it's capable of providing a lot of information, but even more so and less structured than an SRV. So TXT is, as we'll talk about a little bit later, used usually for larger bits of data, such as a DKIM signature, where you have a lot of free-form information that you need to provide with the response. So the first part of DNS that we'll talk about as it relates to Kerio Connect is in regards to email deliverability. And so MX records, obviously, that's the most basic. So to make sure that you're actually, or rather, what is an MX record? It just simply resolves the domain to the responsible MTA or mail transfer agent for a domain. So it's telling a sending server where to go to actually deliver or forward a message. Why is it relevant? Obviously, it allows you to receive inbound mail to your domain. You can't really do email unless you've configured a mail exchange record. So at the very basics, an MX record, if you're planning on doing internet email, is a requirement. In terms of who is actually setting up or configuring an MX record, so you as the owner of the domain name, you have the right and ability to manage your authoritative DNS records, and so you are in charge of managing this. And typically you manage this through your, or I guess always you would manage it through your DNS hosting provider. But I think one of the points I want to make is that you can actually, so whenever you register a domain name, you can actually decouple that, the name servers so that you don't have to use the hosting company or the registrar that you've obtained the domain through. You can actually have that pointed to another service, and one of the things we'll talk about later is a service called Cloudflare, and they provide DNS hosting, and they have a very simplified interface for doing that. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out here, objectives of the webinar, is to emphasize that you can actually point your name servers elsewhere, that they don't have to be done through your official registrar, whoever you registered the domain through. So if you want to learn more about MX records, KB 1210 is where you can go. So that'd be kb.kerio.com/1210. So one of the things I'll do here is to show you via screenshots some of the configuration specifically through Cloudflare for how you would set up these types of records. So here, as you see in the screenshot, when adding a new MX record, you basically have very simplified parameters. You define a priority, which is usually just a simple numerical value of 1 through 10. You can obviously do more, but 5 is kind of a common number for that. If you have multiple, you would assign 5 or 10, but generally just a single MX record for receiving inbound mail is the basics for what you would need. And then the server address, which is going to be an internet host name, the one specifically that actually resolves to the IP address of your Kerio Connect server. So as you're pointing the MX record to a host record, to an A record, it also means that you as well need to configure an A record. So here as well within the Cloudflare configuration, this is how it would appear if you were to add an A record. So you just choose the record type there on the left as A, you put the internet host name that you associated with the MX record, and then the IP address of your Kerio Connect server. So very basic, and then the automatic time to live. For the TTL, generally, I would just recommend keeping that as the default. So yeah, there's a good question here. I guess before I get too further, so I've been introducing Cloudflare, and the question here is whether or not, or kind of what is the benefit of using Cloudflare, or why not just use your registrar's DNS, such as GoDaddy, for example. And certainly you can use GoDaddy or whoever you registered the domain through. You don't have to redirect your name servers elsewhere. I recently have encountered Cloudflare, and I think that they offer DNS hosting for free. They provide a CDN, which I would believe that GoDaddy does as well, and perhaps some registrars that provide DNS hosting would do that as well. But what I found is that the management interface for Cloudflare is very simple. And one of the challenges, I think, in setting up something like this where you're configuring DNS in terms of instruction and training, it's hard because you would have to provide screenshots or details for every registrar, and this is the nuances of how you set up an SRV with this provider and so forth. With Cloudflare, I can provide a standardized training, so these are all screenshots. So whether you've registered your domain through GoDaddy or through any other network solutions or any other registrar, you have the ability to point your DNS to Cloudflare. So this way, I can provide you with instructions, very simplified instructions on how to set up all the DNS records that you need for Kerio Connect without having to provide instructions for network solutions and for GoDaddy and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why I've chosen to use Cloudflare in this example. I also happen to think that their user interface is very simplified and intuitive. So that's kind of why I've chosen to use Cloudflare in this example. So hopefully that answers your question, Tony. To verify, so that's one of the things throughout the presentation here as I'm talking about how to configure these records. Part of it too is the validation aspect, making sure that you've properly set up those records. And so MX Toolbox is probably many of you already familiar with it, but it is a great tool for validating that you've properly set up DNS. And so they have a number of different tools, and as you see in the screenshot here, I'm doing specifically an MX lookup on my domain, buyandbrewing.com, and you can see it returns the IP address. So you can validate, aside from your own local DNS, that from internet DNS, from other internet sources, they're going to properly resolve and get the right IP address for your email domain. So MX Toolbox is definitely a nice resource for validating many of the DNS types of configuration that you've set up. So that's the basics for just email deliverability. Now let's get more into some specifics on identity management in terms of DNS. So first one being reverse lookups, which is a PTR record, and that's resolving an IP address to a name. And the benefit or the reason why you need a PTR or reverse lookup record is because it allows other servers to identify you based on your IP address, because during the initial connection, all they know is your IP, so they need a better way to identify you. And if they don't have the ability to, or if they don't actually resolve your IP address to a name, that's it's kind of like introducing yourself to someone without providing your name. And in a lot of cases, the receiving mail server may interpret that as sort of spammy behavior or inappropriate, and may just outright reject connections from your mail server. So having a reverse lookup record, a PTR record, will definitely improve the deliverability of your messages when forwarding to other email servers. So unlike all of the other records that I'll be pointing out, reverse DNS is actually set up through your internet service provider, because it's mapping an IP to a name, not a name to an IP. So instead of the owner of the domain name that's creating this record, it's actually the owner of the IP address. So this is the one exception where you actually cannot set this up through through Cloudflare, for example, or wherever your DNS hosting provider is. You actually have to go through your internet service provider, because they're the actual owner of the IP address. A lot of times they'll set up a default reverse lookup record for you, but it's not personalized. So for example, I've been using mail.bindbrewing.com, and so we've set it up that our hosting provider actually resolves the IP address to that name, and I'll show that screenshot in just a moment here. So yeah, as I just alluded to, the person or the entity you would contact for making that update is the actual service provider. And we cover in a little bit more detail these types of records, the PTR record, in KB 1223, the essential DNS settings. So here's just a screenshot of the reverse DNS within our hosting environment, which is Webtropia. So they do happen to give us, it's a data center. They give you virtual appliances and so forth. So one of the nice features that they do support is the ability to configure your own reverse DNS records. Otherwise, you might have to contact them or whoever your hosting provider is via some support ticket or alternative means if they don't give you the ability to configure it directly. And so you see here, I've just configured, so they list the IP address, and then I'm just putting in there the internet host name that I'd like to use. Okay, so moving on to DKIM. So another form of identity validation. So DKIM is using a TXT record type. So whereas the previous types were a bit more defined, PTR record, A record, MX record, DomainKeys uses a more generic type of TXT record. But it's still very important to have this, because it does improve the deliverability of your outgoing email, just like PTR records do. So similar to the previous type of record, it allows receiving servers to validate your identity, but in a more specific way that allows them to look up via DNS a special key, that public key that you define in DNS, and that proves that you at least are who you say you are. So it's something that, again, helps receiving servers to validate and ensure that your email address is not being spoofed. Because it's a forward lookup, it's managed by you, so you do have the ability through, and as I'll show in a minute here, via Cloudflare or whoever your hosting provider is, you have the ability to update this record, and I'll show you those steps in just a moment. Let's see, let me just pause for a moment. It looks like there's a few questions that have come in. Oh yes, of course. The sales deck, the presentation. Of course, this will be available afterwards, so I'll make sure to send that to all of you, and that it will be recorded as well, so you'll have access to the recording. Another question. Yes. What about SPF? I'm getting there, Tony. Don't worry. I'll get to that. So for the moment, we're talking about DKIM, and you're one slide ahead of me. So to finish up here with the DKIM. domain keys. So you do have the ability as the owner of the domain to configure this type of record, and that's managed through your DNS hosting provider. If you want to learn more about DKIM, obviously it's in our knowledge base, it's Article 1483. So just to show you the steps of how you go about configuring DKIM, first step is to enable it in Kerio Connect. So you go into the properties for your domain, make sure that you've enabled it, and then there's an option there to show your key. You'll see the part that's under the TXT value. Just select that bit and copy it into your clipboard. And then the next part is within your DNS hosting provider. So in the example I'm using here with Cloudflare, you're going to add a new record, and you see choosing TXT as the type. So with DKIM, there's something called a selector, and Kerio Connect always uses mail._domain key as the selector. So that's the value that you're going to put here. Normally there's a placeholder text in my screenshot. I'm just showing you what I've already pasted in there, but it'll tell you to enter the selector. And then you've got in the second input field the actual pasted text, which is the part that you had copied out of Kerio Connect. Paste it in there, hit add record, and that's basically all you need to do, at least if you're using Cloudflare. And the process obviously would be similar if you're using GoDaddy or Network Solutions or any of the other DNS hosting providers. So to validate your the record that you've set up, obviously I want to make sure that as well as providing instructions for creating the records, that I also provide instructions for how to validate those records to just make sure that you've set them up properly. So you can go to dkimcore.org, and they have a online validation tool. So it's pretty straightforward. You just put in your selector, which is going to be mail. It's always going to be mail in terms of Kerio Connect. And then your domain name. So in my case, it's bindbrewing.com. You click check, and then it will return, hopefully, a green bit of text there indicating that your DKIM is in fact valid, and it'll output for you what it did or what it looked up based on your authoritative name servers. There's another question just before we move on about DKIM and which servers honor DKIM or do DKIM verification for inbound. I mean, obviously, it's hard to say, but these days, pretty much any legitimate email hosting provider that you're going to send to is going to do DKIM verification. So it is very important to make sure that you have DKIM configured for your domain. It's going to certainly reduce the likelihood that that spam you send from your the email you send from your domain will be flagged as spam. So even though unfortunately a lot of spammers, interestingly enough, do now implement DKIM in verifying that in fact they are sending from a legitimate domain, which they can do even though they're still sending you spam content. But certainly from your standpoint as a legitimate sender, having a DKIM record is essential and required, and you definitely want to make sure that you configure this. And that's one of the points I want to emphasize with this webinar, is that it's really not difficult to do, and using a lot of these online tools, you can quite easily configure your own records through DNS. And if your hosting provider doesn't give you an easy interface for managing this type of DNS, certainly it's free to set up an account with Cloudflare. Have a look. It's something I've been using lately, and I actually really like it, and they have a nice, easy to configure setup. So just an option to consider. Someone was asking just if I could go back quickly to the screen for DKIM. So I'll show it here. But again, so our knowledge base is actually pretty thorough in terms of the DNS configuration for DKIM. That was KB 1483. So all of this information is very well documented in our knowledge base. And again, you'll have access to this presentation to the recording afterwards. So if there's any bit here that you miss, you can always have access to it later. So don't worry again about taking strict notes or screenshots. You'll have access to all of this information afterwards. There is a relevant question still about the DKIM. When you're relaying through other mail servers, do you have to set up DKIM on the relay servers as well? I don't believe you do. I think you only need to set it up through Kerio Connect. Just as long as there is a DKIM signature in the header, that's really all that the receiving party needs to validate your domain. So you could, if the relay server supports configuring DKIM, you could alternatively set it up there, but I don't think that would be necessary considering that Kerio Connect already supports it. So I think the short answer is that no, you don't need to also set up DKIM on any of the relay servers that you're forwarding through. So that's a good question. All right, so now moving on to Sender Policy Framework, which is yet another form of validating your identity that will help to improve the reliability of your outgoing mail. So SPF utilizes TXT, just similar to DKIM, where you're basically inputting a string of text. And so kind of similar to how DKIM works, where DKIM provides a signature that's unique and authoritative based on your domain name, SPF basically just defines a list of IP addresses that are allowed to send from your domain. In the example I'm going to show, it's using the most basic and simple form of only allow my MX record, or basically the host that's receiving inbound mail from my domain, allow that to also be responsible for outbound mail. But that's the way that SPF works, is it's just a list of IP addresses essentially. But it allows the receiving server to really definitively authorize the sender to prevent email spoofing, and again to validate the identity of the sender and more specifically the sender's IP address. Because SPF is a forward lookup, it's something that you have the ability as the owner of your domain name to manage through your own DNS. And if you want to learn more about SPF, we do have a KB article. It's 248. But I'm not sure if that article actually points out some of the, maybe it does, but spfwizard.net is a nice, convenient, handy online tool that helps you to build the SPF record, because unfortunately it's not a very straightforward or intuitive syntax. So it's nice to have an online tool that can basically ask you simplified questions and then output the text string that you need to insert into your DNS. So that's what you see in the screenshot here using the spfwizard.net. It asks you very simple questions. What's your domain name? How do you want to allow the, or rather if you want to just say, allow the MX, my outgoing MX record to be the only or to be one of the hosts listed in there. The simplified approach is just to use their recommendations from the pull-down list there, and then there's the option at the very bottom of how you want, if you want to. So this is for inbound, anyways. Whether or not you want strict rejection or a soft fail, or basically just to have it logged and do nothing at all. In my example here, you see I'm just saying reject everything. It's just do a hard fail. So. In terms of adding this, so now that you've copied the text that was output by the SPF Wizard service here within back into the Cloudflare interface, so they give you an option to create an SPF type record, which even though it's a text record, they a lot of the providers will actually give you a shorthand version of that called SPF, which is essentially a text record. And so there you're just defining the domain name, and then the syntax that you want to use, which is what you copied from that SPF wizard. And that's pretty much all you need to do. It's fairly straightforward. And then to validate it, again, going back to MX Toolbox, you see you've got the option there to choose an SPF record lookup. You just put in your domain name, and then it returns the results there. So now we'll talk about discovery services. So we talked about just the basics for email deliverability, ways to help identify your identity and improve the reliability of your outbound email. So discovery services, these are even more, a little bit newer, utilizing SRV type records, but these will help on the client end when they're configuring their desktop applications for instant messaging or for Outlook or for mobile devices. So that's the objective here of automatic discovery. So the first one to point out is the Microsoft Autodiscover service, and this is an SRV record, and it defines the location of your generally an Exchange or your Kerio Connect server. So as you've probably seen, I'm sure whenever you've configured, for example, an ActiveSync account on a smartphone, a lot of times it'll just say, what's your email and password? And based on that information, it will do all kinds of background lookups to try and identify what the responsible server is. And if that process fails, well, then it will usually defer to a secondary screen that asks you for a lot more information that as an end user you may or may not know, but it's a bit inconvenient. And it's definitely much better if end users don't have to, specify their email server address or other parameters. Autodiscover takes care of all that for you, so it makes the setup experience from the end user's perspective a lot more convenient and easier to configure. So obviously I kind of already expanded on the why, which is that it allows for end users to more easily set up their Exchange ActiveSync or Exchange Web Services type of accounts within their applications. So who configures these? It's you as the owner of the domain name. You're able to configure SRV records within your DNS hosting provider. And I just recently published an article, so I'll also go in, so I'll show you the details within Cloudflare. But if you want to follow up, you can go to KB 1899, and it will discuss Autodiscover in a little bit more detail with step-by-step instructions. But just to show you a few screenshots here of how you would configure Autodiscover records in Cloudflare. So it's an SRV record, and actually, as the KB article indicates, there's a few other methods that Autodiscover implements. In terms of how it interacts with Kerio Connect, the most effective is SRV. So for doing properly implementing Autodiscover with Kerio Connect, SRV is the best approach. So you see the two screenshots here. When you're adding an SRV record in Cloudflare, it gives you 7 parameters here. So the service name is _Autodiscover, and that's always going to be the same. Protocol TCP, the name, which is your domain, in my case, bindbrewing.com. It would be whatever your domain is. Priority 0, wait 5. You can just keep those standard. The port should be 443. That's one of the challenges if you're hosting your email server for HTTPS on a non-standard port. I think that this will be a little bit less reliable. Interestingly, I found that even though your SRV record defines the port number, sometimes the client will not even bother to honor that. So I'd say ultimately, or for the best experience, if you can run your secure web services on the default port 443, and then the target being, let's see, in this case, I put bindbrewing.com. Although I think usually you would probably I probably should have put mail.bindbrewing.com, but in my case, actually, bindbrewing.com resolves to that same host name. But actually, the target would be the internet host name of your Kerio Connect server. So looks like there was a couple questions that came in. Let me just pause here to review them and see if I can answer them at this time. Tony's asking the usefulness, or how would I relate the necessity or usefulness of PTR versus DKIM versus SPF. They're all necessary and they're all useful. So I wouldn't say that one is, like, it's not a matter of, if I have to choose two, choose all three. They're all very important. So, certainly make sure that you have all of them configured. Nate was asking a question about what if the web host is different from the mail server. I guess in terms of I think you were relating to the Autodiscover, and certainly that's the purpose of an SRV record for Autodiscover, is to actually point out, because in most cases they will be different. So my screenshot here should be showing the target as mail.bindbrewing.com, which is obviously different than what the website would be. So that's one of the reasons for actually configuring an SRV record, is to tell the client, where to look for your email. Yeah, correct. Thank you, Nate. Yes, that's correct. I made a mistake in the screenshot. It should be mail.yourdomain.com or in my case, mail.bindbrewing.com. And Jeff is pointing out that Autodiscover actually might be required for Outlook 2016. If you don't have Autodiscover set up properly, it will display a secondary dialog, which is terribly difficult for end users to configure. At least this is on the Mac side. Not sure on the Windows side for Outlook, but I believe it might be similar. But it'll ask you for this longer string of text. You can actually just put the internet host name of your mail server there, and that would work. But it's highly unintuitive, and that's part of the reason, part of the motivation for why I chose this topic for this webinar was because I'm finding more and more that Autodiscover is actually a very integral and important component at the desktop side. And that's also why I published recently that KB article specifically for Autodiscover, because it is a very important, and moving forward I see a lot of Microsoft services almost relying and depending on this. So again, a very important component, and it's important to make sure that you set up Autodiscover for your domain name. Yeah, and there's a question from Jeremy about what if the service provider doesn't allow the underscore, and so it would not work. And that's a case where I would actually recommend using Cloudflare. Again, it's a free DNS service. But yeah, that's one of the challenges when you're using generally the DNS services that are provided through your registrar, is that they might not give you the flexibility that you need to properly configure all of these types of records. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to recommend Cloudflare, is because they do give you that flexibility. And again, it's free, so really all you're doing is just pointing your registrar to the name servers of the Cloudflare service. So definitely, I mean, I generally don't like to recommend third-party services, but DNS is such an integral component of Kerio Connect. And I've been quite happy with using Cloudflare. So really, if you do use them, you'll be able to achieve all of these DNS records that I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So and there have been a few questions, related to what if I don't configure all of these. Obviously, you don't have to, but it's going to improve your deliverability and basically the usability of your email system if you can configure all of these. And certainly, I would recommend, and if you can, to configure all of these types of records that I've been talking about to get the best value and usability out of the product. So hopefully your existing service provider gives you the flexibility that you can configure all of these types of records. But if not, again, Cloudflare is a free option, and they seem to work very well. So getting back to the presentation and talking about Autodiscover, so just like with all the other types of records, there's a way to validate that you've done it properly. And so Microsoft, they actually provide an online connectivity tool. Some of you have probably used it before. And this allows you to validate that you've set up your Autodiscover records properly. So they have a couple of different tests, and it's worth pointing out that the Outlook connectivity test, if you've done it properly, will succeed. The Exchange ActiveSync connectivity test, that one actually does not work currently. I know it's something that we're working on. So from the mobile device experience, in most cases, it will actually still succeed for them. It's just that the Microsoft test, their official online test, probably won't succeed. However, it will succeed on the desktop, or rather for mobile devices when they're setting up ActiveSync. So that's just something I wanted to point out, that don't worry if the EAS connectivity test fails. It will still work from the mobile device standpoint. So moving on to the last type of record that I'll talk about in terms of simplifying the setup on the end user side is instant messaging, or specifically XMPP. So this is also an SRV type lookup, and it is defining the location of your XMPP server, which of course is going to be Kerio Connect in our case. Justification: why do you need to set up IM records or XMPP records? Similar to the Autodiscover, it allows users that are setting up their instant messaging applications to easily find your Kerio Connect server just by putting in a few basic parameters, specifically an email address and a password. And it also provides federation, so it allows other email servers, or rather other IM servers, to send instant messages, to share instant messages with your Kerio Connect server. So it's a twofold. One is for And there's actually two types of records that I'll show in just a minute. One for clients when they're setting up their desktop applications, and then there's one for servers if they're trying to forward instant messages to your Kerio Connect server. And as this is a forward lookup, it's managed by you, the owner of the domain name, through your DNS hosting provider. And we do provide documentation in the knowledge base. It's KB Article 1398 for how to configure DNS for instant messaging. But as following the format of all of the other types of lookups here in the presentation, I've just thrown together a few screenshots. So you'll see that, again, getting back to Cloudflare, adding an XMPP record. As I point out, there's two types of records, the client record and the server record. So the service name is _XMPP-client, protocol TCP. The name is your host name, the name is your domain name, bindbrewing.com in my example. Priority is 5, weight is 0. Those are kind of standard values. You don't really need to change those. And then the port number, which generally should be 5222. That's the XMPP port, the default. In most cases, the client should use TLS, so the connection would be encrypted, but it's going to be up to the client and server to negotiate that. Generally, Kerio Connect will support TLS, so it's going to be up to the client whether or not it wants to use encryption. And then the target, which is going to be your internet host name. So I did correctly put it here in this screenshot. On the Autodiscover one, I did not have that correct. Yes, the target here, mail.yourdomain.com, or whatever your internet host name is, or whatever resolves to the IP address of your Kerio Connect server. And so just similar to the other examples, to verify that your XMPP is set up properly, this is actually something you can do through Kerio Connect. When you go into the settings for instant messaging, we have a dialog that you've probably already seen for validating. You just check the button there, check service availability, and it will do a DNS lookup to make sure that you've properly set up the DNS records for XMPP. And so just to summarize all of the links and services that I have pointed out all throughout the presentation, MX Toolbox for mostly just validating that you've configured the DNS settings properly. They have a lot of other cool tools as well for sort of testing availability of your SMTP server. So I always recommend MX Toolbox for those types of things. And then the DKIM.org for validating that you've set up your DKIM record properly. SPFwizard.net for helping to build your SPF record. Obviously the kb.kerio.com, the Kerio knowledge base, as I referred to many articles throughout the presentation. The Cloudflare service that I was showing in many of the screenshots there. The Microsoft Connectivity Wizard, which you see from the link there is testconnectivity.microsoft.com. And then Wikipedia, which I like to refer to throughout for just as a general learning resource, and for those of you that want to learn more about DNS and the different types of DNS records and formatting for all of these, obviously Wikipedia is a great source for that. So to summarize the presentation, email relies very much on DNS, and it's not just an MX record anymore. Nowadays, you need so much more to really make sure that you have properly implemented email in a way that ensures reliability of outgoing messages, but also simplifies the setup for users when they're trying to configure their applications to talk to Kerio Connect. So DNS is much more involving these days than it used to be in the past, where you just had to set up an MX record and that's kind of all you needed to do. So what we talked about was DNS configuration for better reliability, adding credibility to your domain name with the DKIM that ensures your identity, and then simplifying the experience from the desktop side. Of course, as I was showing the Cloudflare service quite often, and it was, at least in my opinion, pretty easy to set up, and you'll see that that's kind of the last point, is that DNS is easy, and it's not to be afraid of it. So again, thanks for paying attention, and hopefully you all found this